In this exercise, we're going to work on our convex and concave shapes, seams. So if we separate these patterns, I have separate patterns for the convex and the concave. And let me separate these larger pieces. So your convex curves are curves or seams that curve away from the shape or on the outside of the shape. Your convex seams are going to be cutting into the shape. So it goes inward toward the shape. Now, we have a couple different exercises here that actually utilize all of these different pattern pieces. So they're the same here, so there are going to be multiple things that you're going to need to cut. Now, I have an exercise here in the parentheses. It says clipping, and clipping is very important. So convex curved clipping is different than concave curved clipping. So when you're working on a garment, maybe you have cutouts in your garment, and maybe there's a convex or a concave cutout. You're going to need to clip appropriately so that the seam allowance that is on the inside of these seams that you sew actually don't create additional bulk. So there are clipping theories for the inside. So that's one of the exercises. So for the convex curved clipping exercise, you'll need to cut 2 of those pattern pieces. And then for the concave curve clipping exercise, you'll need to cut 2 of those. Now there's an additional exercises that utilize these 2 same pattern pieces called convex curve facing and concave curve facing. So for those exercises, you'll need to cut 1 of each of these. And there's a facing piece that goes with each of those. So for the convex facing, I have a facing piece here. And make sure that you watch the introduction lecture for what a facing is. So we're going to be cutting 1 of these and 1 fusible. That means interfacing. And also for the concave curve facing, we're going to be cutting 1 of these out of self and 1 out of fusible, which also means interfacing. So, and that's actually printed here in red. So these are much narrower pieces than the original piece because this piece is going to be sewn here, face sides together, clipped, turned to the inside, and then understitched all the way around. So that's a rather large exercise. But we're going to actually cut everything together, and then the exercises will be separate. So understand that this whole exercise with the concave and the convex is going to be a very long tutorial, but you will be able to actually skip through if you want to use the chapter markers in the video. So to actually find each one. So because I'm going to keep this all together in one tutorial because we utilize the same patterns. So now we have notches that identify which pattern pieces go with each other. So the concave, you can see the notches are all clipped on the inside. And for the convex, all the notches are on the outside. Now, I want to warn you about putting your notches in. So we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both of these stitch lines. So that means when you're cutting out your notches, do not notch larger than 1/8 of an inch, because we don't want that slit notch when we clip it to match the pattern pieces. We don't want that clip going beyond the 1/4 inch. So when I notch these, I'm going to do very short notches, just 1/8 of an inch. And I think that as a rule, maybe we could say that your notch clips on your sample or garment pieces should never be more than half of what the seam allowance is. So as you can see, I have very tiny notch clips, even though, and they're very tiny, even though the drawn notches are much larger. I make them larger so you understand where they are. So there's one set done, and I'm going to do these others really quickly as well. Just very short and quick. Once you've done this several times, you get actually pretty quick at this, at notching and understanding how to notch and what places are good to notch in. All right, so I've got everything notched again, really short notches, no longer than 1/8 of an inch. All right, so now I'm ready to lay out my fabric and get everything cut. Just a reminder again, as I set the 2 larger pieces aside, these 2 facing pieces you will need to cut out of fusible. And remember from the previous exercises in level 1, I like to use the Pellon EK130 Easy Knit interfacing. The reason being is that this actually is a knit interfacing. It doesn't matter with your wovens, but it's very lightweight. It actually molds with the fabric, and if you need to, you can layer it up for more body. So that's what I'll be using today for the fusing pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and lay this out and cut all these pieces. Okay, so now that everything is cut out, let's identify the face sides. So I'm just going to mark all these pieces as face sides. And then remember, I have 2 of each of these. So all I'm going to do, and they're the same thing, so I'm just going to do this and then flip it over to do this. There's no interfacing on these pieces, even though this is just a cutting exercise. Okay, so I've got these 2 done. Let's set these aside. Now, for the concave and convex with a facing, which are these 2 pieces, we actually need to take these fusible pieces, fusible interfacing, and we need to fuse them to the wrong side of the facing. So to prepare for that, I can flip these over. These are the facings, and then I'm going to feel for the textured side, and the textured side goes to the wrong side of the facing, just like that. The textured side, this is the textured side, goes to the wrong side of the facing. And the first step you're going to do is you're going to press these to the facing. The heat with the iron releases the glue that is on here, and it will stick to the fabric. So we're going to go to the pressing mat. I'm going to use a press cloth. I'm going to fuse these, and then we'll be at the machine ready to sew these samples together. Okay, so we're ready to work on our concave and convex curves. I have them both here with me. So for the concave, this is going into the body of what we're sewing, so that's the concave. And I already have it lined up with the notches, and I've just put 1 pin here. Of course, you could put more pins around here if you would like. Now, this is going to be a very tight curve, so you'll have to go slow and really manage your piece as you sew. So this is going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're not really going to turn this right side out or face side out because this is for clipping reasons. So you know how to clip a concave and a convex curve for when you're actually putting these or sewing them in your garments. So I'm going to get started here, right? It doesn't matter which side you start on. I'm going to start right here at this edge. Right there, I'm going to put my needle down, and then I'm going to start with a back stitch. All right, and now that I've got that started, now I'm actually gonna be holding on to the fabric, but I'm just gonna be guiding it and like turning it along to match this edge to the 1/4 inch marking, or the presser foot should be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So go slow, and then you're gonna have to use both hands to kind of turn this into the machine right there at the needle. So you got to keep an eye here as you're going into the edge of that seam allowance mark, and then also you're going to have to move this outer edge of fabric around because you want to make sure that you're getting an even stitching and that you're not getting uneven rippling or roping as you're sewing into your curve. So I'm just turning the fabric. Just continue to turn and go slow as you need to and come back up. Remember, we have a notch here for our seam allowance, so that's where we're aiming for. And just continue to turn that up. And I'm going to back stitch now. And then I'm going to take this out and we'll have a look at this. So there is my concave seam. That looks pretty good. I'll trim my other threads there. All right, and then we'll have another look at this when we get to the ironing. I'm going to go ahead and I've got my convex here. That's the outside curve. The curve is going to go on the outside of the body. So here I am. I've just got a couple of pins. That's all I really need. Remember, you have everything lined up here at your notches. And I'm just going to start here at the outside here. This is where our notches, our 1/4 inch seam. So line that up there. And I'm going to put my needle down and I'm going to start with a back stitch. And then you're going to have to use your hands in this turning motion. As you're turning it with this hand, you're also turning it coming out of the back in a circular motion. Do a little bit. See how I'm doing little short controlled bursts as I turn each. I'm turning this way and then I'm turning this way right in there, and I'm watching this edge as it goes into that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So sometimes when you have these curves or really tight curves, it's better to do very short controlled bursts so that you don't get over stretching, and I'll show you what I mean once I finish this seam up here. And I'm coming back up to the end, my 1/4 inch seam, and getting ready to back stitch. Okay. Pull this out of the machine, clip the threads. So if you see here, just lightly, you can see a little bit of a rippling, and that's just because the fabric is just slightly being stretched just a little bit, and that's okay. Because we're actually doing this turning motion where we kind of have to force the fabric to be turned. So that's okay. That will all press out. It will be fine. And that's what we'll do. We'll go over and press these, and then we'll actually talk about how you actually clip into the concave and to the convex if you are going to turn this face side out. So let's go over to the press mat. Okay, so we have the concave seam and the convex seam for the clipping exercise. And we're not going to keep these flipped to the face side because we want to remind ourselves how we clip things for the concave and the convex. Now, for the concave, we're just going to make clips, little slit clips. And the reason is because I'm going to show you this. Let me put the other one out of the way a little bit. So the reason is if we try to fold this to the face side like this, what happens if we look at the inside, it wants to pull, it wants to open up, right? Because when we make this curve to turn it to the face side, it's actually wanting to turn up the opposite way, right? So this actually wants to turn up and make a little smile like this, right? But underneath, this has a lot of tension on it. So what we want to do with the concave seams is we're going to just make little clips, not all the way to the seam allowance, and I'm only doing about a 1/4 inch. It depends on how long that seam is. It depends on the acuteness of the seam or the tightness. This is a very tight circle, so we need to make quite a few clips. Okay, so now I have all those clips, and now look, I can almost pull it carefully and make it a straight line. So now if I try to turn these face side outs, it has relaxed enough to where I can actually work it out so it makes that nice smiling face, right? So we don't want to keep it this way because this is the clipping exercise. So we want to keep it this way, and we will actually, after we press it, we will actually mark this, and I'll remind you about the notebook. This is the concave clipping exercise. We would write your name and then the concave clipping exercise and then the date. Now, for the convex is a little bit different because if we try to turn this face side out, okay, we can kind of get a circle, but look what happens on the inside. if you can see that there's all that rippling in there, and that means that there's too much fabric along that seam. So what we're going to do is we're going to clip little triangles out, and I'll do one here in the center of it just to show you what that will look like. Okay, get that out of the way. Okay, so this is the little triangles that we're going to do, and that was approximately in the center. So the way I actually like to do it, if that's the center, then I'm actually going to fold this in half, making sure that my seam lines are lined up. And then what I can do is I can just take a diagonal clip to just close to that stitch line but not through it, and that creates a triangle. And then I like to fold again, do half of that. Now of course it depends on how tight this curve is. We'll see what this one looks like. So I'm going to fold my other two, this one to the center. It just makes the clipping a little bit easier and more uniform when you do it like that. So I'm folding in half. Make sure that your seam lines line up because you don't want to accidentally on one side clip that seam. Okay, and then from the center I'll match the notches, and then I'll clip again. And I'm just doing an angled clip. Some of them are deeper than others or wider than others. It's okay. So those are the ones that I'm going to do for right now. So let me see if I can turn this face side out and have a look and see what it looks like. Okay, so it still makes this nice U shape, but look at the difference. It's a lot smoother, and then look at the inside. It's not as puckery, right, around there. So we could probably do a couple more clips if we want to. Get this out. We could do a couple more clips if we want to, depending on the size of the angle. But I'm going to keep it this way because this is just a reminder. This is how we need to clip for a convex shape. So that's the curve on the outside of the garment. So I would actually go ahead and label this. You're going to label this one as well. Convex clipping, the date, and of course your name. And so these would go straight into your binder, your notebook. Okay, so now that we have the facing of our convex curve all fused together, now we just need to match the face sides together. So I'm going to match the face sides of the facing to the face side of the garment, matching our notches. They're reclipped here. So I'm going to match these notches here, and then I'm going to go ahead and just kind of pin around, and that's just to keep everything together. So I've got a few pins here, and notice that I'm pinning from the inside toward the outside. And I'm pinning perpendicular to the edge. Okay. And that's just, I'm doing it for, all right. So I just did that for, so that you could see how you can be pinning your curves. Now you could pin this way, but if you pin going in the direction of your sewing on a curve, you may be actually stretching out this curve. And by pinning perpendicular to the edge of the curve, you know that these stitch points in between each of these pins will be evenly distributed when you sew. So this one's all ready. We're going to go over to the machine and get this all sewn together. Okay, so we're ready to sew our convex facing on. We have it all pinned together, and we're going to use a regular stitch length. That's 12 to 14 stitches per inch, and it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance as our notch indicates. And we will just kind of get things going. I remove that pin just to make sure we're at quarter inch. Lift everything up, your presser foot up, and then I like to start with the needle down, and I'm going to backstitch to begin with. And again, if you remember from your curves, I'm going to use this hand to turn it this way while I'm using this hand to turn it into the needle. Keeping everything nice and even. And I'm just removing the pins as I go. I'm turning this way, and then I'm turning into the needle. Just go slow. Of course, I went a little faster there. I'm coming up to the end of my stitch line. Just make sure everything is aligned. Get ready to backstitch. All right. And then we'll take it out and we'll have a look at this really quick. Okay. So this is our stitch line. Right around here, right? And then of course this is the opposite side, and this is our garment side, right? So we're not quite done yet. Move these pins out of the way. So now what we need to do, since this is a facing, we're actually going to understitch. We're going to understitch on the facing, and I'm not going to press this first. I'm going to wait to press it until after. And this one is a little bit tricky because it's such a small piece, and this curve here is really is very curvy. I mean, this is practically a half circle. What we want to do is we want to make sure for our understitching that the seam allowance is going toward the facing, because we're going to stitch on the right side or the face side of the facing. So we're going to want to make sure that this seam allowance is actually attached to the facing side. So understitching is making sure you keep the seam allowance under the facing and away from the garment. So that's where we're going to want to stitch. We're going to want to stitch about a 1/16 away from that seam allowance. You see how it's folded there? Now the challenging part is because this is a curve, you're going to have to work a little bit underneath. You'll have to do a little stitch a little bit and then readjust yourself in place and then stitch some more. So I'm going to get this started, and I'm going to see if I can angle this camera up just a little bit so we get a little bit more in there. Okay, so I'm going to start here, and I'm stitching on the face side of the facing only, keeping that seam allowance toward the facing. So let's get this in here, and I'm going to just put it underneath the presser foot. And I'm going to put that needle down, right? And this is going to be a little tricky to see in the camera. So I'm going to break away here and see if I can get the camera right on top of this so you can see what's going on. Okay, so I'm back, so I repositioned the camera so you can see kind of like right on top of here, and we've got this seam, and I want to make sure that I'm kind of pulling this away. I'm not really stretching it, I'm just making sure that I'm not getting any kind of bubble that's actually going to be not right on that seam. So I want to make sure that this is pulled away from each other. So I'm going to get this started. I'm just going to do a quick tack, stitch, back stitch, tack. Okay. And then I'm going to have all this ready, and make sure under here that this seam allowance is going toward that facing. Okay, so I'm pulling, so you'll just need to go slow. And I feel like I'm getting the seam allowance isn't folding under the facing, so I'm going to look under here. I'm going to make sure this is going this way by pressing it that way. And then on top here, you'll just have to keep your finger here so you can feel it. And I'm just kind of pulling that away. And I'm still stitching close to that seam line. Look under here, still going toward the facing. And pull it out some more. So even though this is on a curve, it actually looks like we're sewing a straight line. And I'm trying not to get too far away from that seam. Again, just keep checking underneath, and this is kind of a long seam. So one of the things that you'll look for as far as where you're stitching, try to find a guide here somewhere on the foot that you will be able to eye, so you know that you're trying to stay as consistent as possible with that stitching. And this is curving around, so I'm trying to flatten this so that there's good lighting here for you to see. Okay, we're starting to come up toward the tail end here. Folding that under the facing. We're almost there. And we're coming up to the end of this sew. And I'm going to get ready to backstitch here. All right. And then we'll take it out of the machine. Okay, so this is my stitching along the way, and it looks a little bit ripply, but I'm going to actually pull back on the camera really quick. Okay, so this is what the finished facing looks like. I got pretty even stitching. It is a little ripply, and it's automatically wanting to turn into itself, which is nice, but let's have a look here on the inside really quick. And yes, the seam is rippling, and remember our concave and convex clipping, that's what we're going to come in here. We're going to clip this now so that some of these little ripples will go away. And then we'll give it one final press and everything will turn up to the inside really nicely. Okay, so here we have the convex facing, and we did our understitching, which looks really nice, but then we have all this rippling. If we turn this face side out, and then we press it, all those ripples will kind of be pressed in place, and then they may show onto the outside. So this is what we're gonna do. Turn it back to the inside out. Okay, so there we go. If you remember the convex clipping exercise, we're going to do this one a little bit differently. We're not going to clip little triangles, because even if we clip little triangles, it's not really going to do a lot. You see how ripply it is around these edges? It kind of looks like a pie edge. But what we're going to do is we're going to trim this edge as close as we can to this stitching. So I'm going to get in here, be careful that you don't clip the facing, and I'm going to clip this all the way around. Now remember, we have the understitching, so that's what's going to be holding this fabric. Just don't clip your understitching stitching. So what this will do is it makes the seam allowance much less, and we're actually just clipping off all of those ripples. Think of it as I mentioned, it looks like a pie crust. We're just cutting off that pie crust edge. Okay, so now we have very little rippling. There's only a little seam allowance. I'm going to turn this to the face side, and that understitching is actually holding everything together. And now nothing is showing through to the face side. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare this for my notebook by giving it one last press. Just going to press this really nicely, nice and flat. Right? And here is the outside, and look how nice that curve is. Okay, so now we're going to prepare this for our notebook by labeling it convex facing with understitching, the date, and your name. Okay, so I've got my concave facing all fused. Now I just need to match it to the garment. And so I'm going to match face side of the facing to the face side of the garment. And I'm going to be matching my notches here that are reclipped if I needed to do that. So here I'm just going to match this, line those all up. And then I've got some pins. And I'm just going to take a few and I'm pinning perpendicular to the edge of my seam allowance from where I'm sewing. All right. And this is a very short seam, so I only need a few pins. And I'm pinning this way because I want to make sure that I'm going to start here, I'll remove the pin, and then sew up to, and as soon as I get close to the pin, I'll remove that and then continue sewing. And that's just to ensure that between the pins of where I'm sewing, that there's going to be an even distribution of any kind of pulling that we might encounter. And hopefully that we won't have that happen anyway. So this one's all ready. Let's go over to the machine and sew this together. Okay, so we're ready to do our concave stitching for the facing. This is the facing here. So we're going to sew it to the garment, and this is a very tight curve, I know. It just gives you a little bit more practice. So we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. That's where our notches are telling us. So it's a 1/4 inch seam, and we're going to sew with a regular stitch length. That's 12 to 14 stitches per inch. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to stitch around here. Remember, you're going to have to do your curve stitching, and we're going to be working it the opposite way than we did before. So 1/4 inch, slide this under here. We're going to be matching the edge of that foot, and I'm going to start off with a back stitch to tack the top. Okay, so now we're going to get ready, and we're going to turn into, so we're going to be turning it this way. So turn in to that without stretching. You don't want to stretch it like that. You just want to casually turn it around the foot. Make sure you're keeping that 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm turning, gliding it, nice glide. And we're coming up here to the end. Continue turning that around. See how it's coming back around to meet us. And I'm going to take this pin out. And I'm going to get ready to backstitch up here. And backstitch when we're done. At least for this seam. So since this is a facing, we're going to want to do some understitching. And understitching is to keep the seam allowance under the facing. And so we want the seam allowance to go toward the facing, and I'm not going to even bother going to press it first because we don't really need to. And what we're going to do is we're going to fold the facing over the seam allowance, and that seam allowance is going to be going onto that facing, but we're going to stitch on the face side of the facing. So right here, and we don't really need to press this or pin it in place because as we're going in line, we're going to be holding it like this, and I'm going to continue pull that facing away from the garment piece, which is this side, and making sure that the seam allowance is against the facing, and it'll be like we're sewing a straight seam. So we're going to get this started. I'm going to put it under the presser foot, and I'm going to start off with a back stitch. And we want to be sewing about 1/16 away from this seam, the original seam that we did. So find a good place on your presser foot as kind of like a guide or a landmark to actually do that stitching. We want it to be as consistent as possible. So there's my back stitch, and now all I have to do is, as I sew, kind of pull this away. But I got to keep my hands up here while I sew. So I'm going to do a little by little, and I'm just pulling this away. Make sure that you still have your seam allowance going toward the facing. And you see these little ripples? So it looks like it's going to pleat or gather. You want to make sure that those are out of the way and that the needle does not clip one of those that actually creates a pleat. So just kind of go slow, and it'll feel like you're sewing a straight line, but you're just kind of working this away from each other. And see, I'm getting a little bit of a pleat here. I want to make sure that that doesn't pleat. So I'm going to put the needle down, lift the presser foot, and just kind of do a little wiggle and pull that away. Okay. Go back And I'm going to continue just pulling it, making sure that your seam allowance is underneath that facing. And we're doing really good here. Right, and we're coming up to the end, so I'm going to get ready to backstitch. And we can take this out now. And we can have a look at this, what it looks like, right? But it's actually on a curve, so I'm just going to fold this up to the inside, right? Let's clip this other thread, our beginning thread. Now it's not laying totally very flat, right? And the reason is because we need to clip. Remember, this is a concave, so we need to come in here and clip that so it releases this so that it can actually lay flat, because we have a really tight curve here and we want it to lay really flat. So we're going to take care of that over at the pressing mat. Okay, so we're ready to finish up our concave facing. So this is the facing that we actually want to turn to the face side, but it's not really working for us, right? I have all this tension here on this seam allowance. So what I'm going to do, instead of clipping it like I have clips, or like we clipped the concave clipping exercise, I'm not going to clip. I'm actually just going to trim all of this very close to my stitching line there. So that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to trim it very close to my understitching line and not getting that understitching line, right? And if you have smaller scissors, they might help, or even applique scissors might help you do this as well. Just be sure that you're not clipping the facing or any of that understitching. So the reason we want to do this is because we don't want that extra fabric to show through to the face side. A lot of these facings, especially this one on this curve, we don't want to see any kind of imprint on the fabric. So I've clipped that all the way there, and you see it's still being held on by the understitching. But now when we flip this to the underside, right, it makes a really nice curve, right? And this puckering will come out when I press it, and I'm going to do that right now. Let's keep this up, give you a little smile there. Now the nice thing about that understitching and doing it is that it still holds all of the shape. Let's have a look at it here on the other side. Got a little bit of a pucker there. We can kind of steam that out. Let's have a look at where that is. Right there in this spot. There's nothing wrong in that spot, so I'm just going to see if I can steam that out. But that's how we would do that concave facing seam, is trimming those close to that stitching. Okay, so now we're ready to label this concave facing with understitching, the date, and your name.